I want you to picture a scene with me for a second. The setting feels, incredibly ancient, but the dynamics at play are honestly something you'd see tearing across your news feed tonight.
Oh, absolutely. It's incredibly relevant.
Right. So imagine this massive, really intimidating Roman courtroom. You've got these huge stone walls, the echoes, just that heavy, oppressive atmosphere of imperial authority. And at the center of it all stands a man in chains.
Just completely vulnerable.
Exactly. He's a prisoner looking entirely outgunned. And across the room, you have a notoriously ruthless Roman governor sitting right there in the judge's seat.
Yeah, holding all the cards.
And flanking the governor is this high-powered, silver-tongued attorney. I mean, a literal hired gun brought in by the absolute highest religious authorities of the day.
Of heavy hitters.
Yeah. And the goal of these accusers is just simple, brutal, and entirely focused. They want a quick execution. They want this prisoner silenced permanently. But here is the twist, and it's a massive twist.
It really is.
By the time this hearing is over, the prisoner in chains doesn't just defend himself. He actually, effectively, puts his powerful captors on trial.
It's just a phenomenal historical moment. I mean, when you look at the source material analyzing Acts 24, specifically focusing on Paul as his chosen instrument, it completely dismantles the idea of this being just some dry historical record.
Right. It reads like a thriller.
It really does. What we have here is outright psychological warfare. We have complex legal maneuvering, and underneath it all, there's this profound theological chess match going on.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Knowledge is most valuable when it's understood and applied, right?
Exactly. And analyzing the mechanisms of this trial, I mean, it gives us a total masterclass in human nature, systemic corruption, and divine sovereignty.
And that is exactly our mission today. We're going to extract the author's core arguments about this legal showdown, explore the theological implications of what it actually means to be on trial for your faith, and, well, distill practical principles for you.
Because this isn't just dusty history.
No, not at all. It is a blueprint. It's a blueprint for how to face false accusations, how to navigate rigged systems, and how to speak absolute truth to absolute power.
Which is something I think we all need to know how to do.
So true. So let's propel ourselves right into that courtroom in Caesarea. It's been 5 days since the prisoner, the Apostle Paul, arrived under this really heavy Roman guard. The doors to the hearing room swing open, and the high-powered prosecution walks in.
And they are bringing their absolute heaviest hitters to this.
Yeah. Our source notes that the high priest himself, Ananias, makes the trip down from Jerusalem, and he brings this whole delegation of elders.
Which is honestly a detail we really need to pause on because the mechanics of that are staggering.
Why is it such a big deal?
Well, Ananias was the high priest from AD 47 to 59. This is a man with immense, practically king-like religious authority in Judea. So for a high priest to leave Jerusalem, travel all the way down to the coastal city of Caesarea, just to personally oversee the prosecution of a single, seemingly insignificant traveling preacher, that is highly irregular.
Wow. I didn't realize how strange that was.
Yeah, it tells you everything you need to know about their desperation. They view Paul as an existential threat to their entire power structure.
I'm trying to think of like a modern equivalent. It's almost like the CEO of a massive multinational corporation flying across the world just to sit in on a small claims court hearing for some low-level former employee.
That's exactly it. It screams insecurity.
But Ananias isn't just relying on his own presence to intimidate the governor, right?
Mm-hmm.
The source points out he brings in a specialist.
Right, an attorney named Tertullus.
Tertullus.
Yeah, and the author gives us a really fascinating linguistic note here. Tertullus is actually a diminutive form of the Roman name Tertius, but his title is what really matters.
What was his title?
Well, the text calls him an attorney, but the original Greek word the author highlights is rheteros. Yeah, and this is the only time this specific word appears in the entire New Testament.
Okay, I'm hung up on that term, rheteros. I mean, we get the word rhetoric from it, obviously.
Right, exactly.
But in the context of a Roman courtroom, what does that actually mean? Was he just, like, a lawyer who happened to be good at public speaking?
It's much deeper than that. Let's look at how the Roman legal system actually processed these claims. The Romans prized formal oratory above almost everything else in public life.
Really? More than just the facts of the case?
Oh, absolutely. A rheteros wasn't just a legal scholar. He was a highly trained professional persuader. He understood the exact psychological triggers of Roman officials.
Wow.
And the source suggests that, given his Roman name, Tertullus was likely a Hellenistic Jew or possibly even a Roman Gentile.
Wait, a Hellenistic Jew, Break down what that cultural hybridity meant in this specific room, because that seems really important.
It's crucial. So a Hellenistic Jew would be someone ethnically Jewish, perhaps adhering to the religion, but they'd be completely immersed in Greco-Roman culture, language, and philosophy.
So they sort of walked in both worlds.
Exactly. This is the ultimate cultural chameleon. You have to remember, the Jewish elders in Jerusalem were fundamentally opposed to Roman occupation. They despised the Romans.
Right.
But when they needed to get a Roman governor to execute someone for them, they couldn't just walk in and demand it in their own way. They needed a translator.
Ah, I see. Not just for the language, but for the culture.
Precisely. Tertullus was the guy who knew how to play the Roman game perfectly. He knew how to frame Jewish religious grievances in the exact language of Roman imperial anxiety.
Man, he's like an ancient lobbyist.
That is a perfect way to put it.
A hired gun who knows exactly which palms to grease and, which buzzwords to use. And his opening strategy really reflects that perfectly.
Oh, it's a masterclass in manipulation.
According to the text, Tertullus begins his argument without touching a single fact of the case. He starts with this incredibly thick flattery. He heaps praise on Governor Felix, calling him most excellent. He thanks him for the lengthy time of peace they've experienced under his rule and praises the reforms being made through Felix's foresight.
Right.
Now, on the surface, maybe that just sounds like standard diplomatic protocol.
Yeah.
But the author reveals this incredibly dark irony behind these words.
It is entirely cynical. I mean, flattery in formal speech is what the Romans called the captatio benevolentiae, the securing of goodwill. That was standard practice.
Like buttering up the judge.
Right. But Tertullus takes it to an absurd extreme. What's fascinating here is, first of all, the title most excellent was an equestrian rank. It was usually reserved for men of a much higher social standing than Felix.
Oh, wait. What was Felix's actual status?
Felix was actually a freedman. He was a former slave who had somehow ruthlessly climbed the ranks.
Wow. So Tertullus is instantly inflating Felix's social ego right out of the gate.
Exactly. But the real dark irony, as the source makes clear, is this peace and these reforms that Tertullus is praising.
Because Felix wasn't exactly a peacemaker, was he?
Not in the way we understand peace, no. The peace that existed in Judea wasn't the result of, tranquility or equitable governance. It was the result of state-sponsored terror.
That is dark.
Yeah. Felix was a fierce, brutal ruler. He was known for repeatedly crucifying the leaders of any uprisings.
So when Tertullus praises his reforms,
He's actually giving a rhetorical nod to bloody purges. He's looking at a tyrant who maintains order through mass execution, and he's calling him a visionary reformer.
that is deeply unsettling. He's buttering Felix up by praising the very violence Felix uses to oppress the Jewish people.
It's completely transactional.
He's basically saying, we love how brutally you crush rebellions.
Yeah.
And hey, look what we brought you, a rebel to crush.
Exactly. It is a highly calculated psychological setup. Tertullus is paving the way to present Paul as the ultimate disturber of this supposed peace.
Wow.
He flatters the governor's ego regarding his ability to maintain order, precisely so he can trigger the governor's anxiety about losing that order.
Which brings us to the actual trap Tertullus lays out. The author of our source categorizes Tertullus's argument into three specific, incredibly dangerous charges.
Yes, and we need to look at these closely.
Let's walk through the mechanisms of these, because they clearly aren't random. The first is a political charge. He calls Paul a troublemaker who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world. Why start there? Why is global agitation the lead item?
Because if you want to get a Roman governor's attention, you talk about the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome.
Right. Keep the peace at all costs.
Exactly. Rome's primary objective in its provinces was extracting taxes and maintaining absolute order. And Judea was a notoriously volatile province. It was a powder keg of anti-Roman sentiment.
So riots were the worst-case scenario.
Yes, Jewish uprisings were a perennial, exhausting problem for the imperial administration. So by framing Paul as a global agitator, a guy sparking riots everywhere he goes, Tertullus is accusing Paul of sedition against the Roman Empire.
He's painting him as a terrorist.
Yes. He is pushing the exact button that would make Felix think, if I don't eliminate this guy, word will get back to the emperor in Rome that I'm letting an insurrectionist run wild in my province, and then my head will be on the chopping block.
Because the penalty for sedition against Rome was...
Death. Usually crucifixion. That's strike one.
Man. Then comes the second charge, which the author categorizes as the doctrinal charge. Tertullus says Paul is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Now, to a casual modern reader, that just sounds like, an internal religious squabble, like calling someone a member of a different denomination. But how did Tertullus weaponize that specific label in a Roman court?
This is where we see the absolute genius of the Hellenistic Jewish lawyer at work.
Okay, unpack this for me.
So the Roman Empire was generally tolerant of the various local religions they conquered. As long as those religions didn't threaten the state, they left them alone. Judaism was what they called a religio licita, which means a recognized, tolerated religion. It enjoyed very specific legal protections under Roman law. For instance, Jewish people were exempt from having to sacrifice to the Roman emperor.
That's a massive concession by Rome.
Yeah.
I mean, they didn't do that for just anyone.
A huge concession. But by labeling Paul's movement a sect of the Nazarenes, Tertullus is actively trying to sever Christianity from those protections.
Ah, he's saying they aren't real Jews.
Exactly. He is telling Felix, this man and his followers are not mainstream Judaism. This is a rogue cult. They do not enjoy the legal umbrella of the ancient Jewish faith.
Wow.
The source points out that to the Orthodox Jewish leaders, the way was certainly not part of Judaism. So by using the term sect of the Nazarenes, Tertullus is trying to make early Christianity sound as politically dangerous and legally illegitimate as possible.
He wants to strip Paul of his religious immunity.
Precisely.
It reminds me of a modern PR crisis firm dealing with an algorithm. They're trying to trigger a specific institutional immune response. Tertullus inputs the exact keywords, riot, plague, unsanctioned sect, that force the Roman legal machinery to classify Paul as a virus that needs to be eradicated.
That's a great way to put it.
He just bypasses logic entirely to get a guaranteed institutional response.
That's a perfect analogy. And then he delivers the final blow, the third charge, the capital charge.
Right.
Tertullus claims Paul tried to desecrate the temple. Specifically, the accusation stemming from earlier events in Acts was that Paul brought a Gentile into the inner restricted precincts of the temple.
Now, I need you to explain this to me, because the first two charges, sedition and leading an illegal cult, they seem designed to get Rome to execute Paul for Rome's own reasons.
Yes.
So why add a charge about the Jewish temple? Why would a pagan Roman governor care about the architectural purity of a Jewish building?
Because of a very rare, highly specific concession Rome had made to the Jewish authorities.
Another concession.
Yeah. The Romans were desperate to keep the peace in Jerusalem. They understood that the temple was the absolute epicenter of Jewish identity. So Rome allowed the Jewish authorities the right to execute anyone, even a Roman citizen, who desecrated the temple by bringing a Gentile beyond the court of the Gentiles.
Wait, really?
Oh, yeah. They literally had warning stones carved in Greek and Latin telling foreigners that entering meant death and that they would only have themselves to blame.
Wait, so Rome outsourced capital punishment for this one specific religious infraction?
Exactly. It was a pressure release valve to keep the Jewish populace pacified.
Unbelievable.
So by bringing this third charge, Tertullus is essentially saying to Felix, look, even if you don't find him guilty of sedition against Caesar, he broke a law that you, the Romans, have already authorized us to punish with death. So hand him over or execute him yourself on our behalf because the law demands it.
It is an incredibly lethal, hermetically sealed legal web, and the source notes that all the Jews present joined in the verbal attack, claiming these things were true.
Yeah, piling on.
They expected Felix to just dispatch Paul quickly. It's a highly coordinated smear campaign. They take a tiny bit of context, like the fact that there was a commotion in the temple, and they mix it with massive coordinated distortions.
Classic tactic.
So for the listener hearing this, who might be facing their own version of a coordinated attack in their workplace or their community or their personal life, how do you defend yourself when the opposition's narrative is this precise, this emotionally charged, and this completely fabricated?
It's so hard because the natural human instinct is to fight fire with fire. When you are being smeared, you want to get emotional. You want to hurl accusations back. You want to try and out-rhetoric the opposition to win the crowd.
I'm going to defend your honor.
Right. But what we see from Paul is the exact opposite. He doesn't try to out-flatter Tertullus. He doesn't match their emotional frenzy. He completely ignores the theatrics and dismantles their carefully constructed narrative using the only tool that actually holds weight. Verifiable facts.
Okay, let's unpack this defense.
Yes.
Because it is an absolute masterclass. Let's look at how he takes apart this machinery, starting at verse 10. Tertullus relied entirely on flattery and weaponized feeling.
Holy.
But Paul, who the author reminds us is fulfilling a calling from Jesus to carry his name before Gentiles and kings. He stands up and delivers cold, hard logic. He doesn't start with theology. He starts with his itinerary.
He dismantles their timeline.
Yes. Walk us through that.
Right. Paul starts chronologically. He respectfully acknowledges Felix's years as a judge, but he totally skips the sycophantic flattery.
No, most excellent stuff.
Right. Then he points out to Felix, as you can verify for yourself, not more than 12 days ago, I went up to Jerusalem to worship.
Why is that specific number, 12 days, so vital to his case?
Because it mathematically breaks the sedition charge. Just think about the logistics. 12 days total. By the time you factor in the days it takes to travel to Jerusalem, the days he spent engaged in ritual purification inside the temple, the time it took to be arrested, held in the barracks, and then transferred over multiple days down to Caesarea under Roman guard.
Oh, wow.
There is literally no time left over. There is no mathematical way Paul had the time to organize a global revolt, let alone a local one. He is deflating the grand conspiracy theory using basic addition and subtraction.
He's saying, I haven't even been in town long enough to be the terrorist mastermind you're claiming I am.
Exactly.
He just punctures the balloon of this global threat.
But then he takes aim at the idea of the mob. He says they didn't find him arguing with anyone. They didn't find him stirring up a crowd in the temple courts or in the synagogues or anywhere in the city.
He's checking all their boxes and saying, nope.
Yeah, he directly contradicts Tertullus's claim of him being a public agitator. And then Paul does something really fascinating regarding Roman legal procedure and the burden of proof. Yes, and the source highlights this as a highly sophisticated legal maneuver.
What does he do?
Paul says, nor can they prove to you the things they are accusing me of doing. He demands the evidence. But more importantly, he highlights the missing witnesses.
The missing witnesses.
Right. Under the framework of Roman law, hearsay was entirely insufficient for a capital conviction. The actual accusers, the literal eyewitnesses to the alleged crime, had to be present in court.
Ah, and who's missing?
Well, Paul brings up the fact that the people who actually instigated the riot in Jerusalem, these Jews from the province of Asia, are conspicuously absent from this courtroom.
Right. He says there are some Jews from the province of Asia who should be here before you and bring charges if they have anything against me. So how does that land with a Roman judge like Felix?
Oh, it's devastating. The author argues that this absence effectively invalidates the whole trial. Paul is quietly, respectfully, but very firmly raising the issue of gross procedural injustice. He's pointing to Ananias and Tertullus and telling Felix, these men are powerful, yes, but they didn't see anything. The people who supposedly saw me desecrate the temple didn't even bother to show up to testify.
So it's all hearsay.
Exactly. The high priest and his hired orators only have hearsay. They have zero first-hand proof.
He strips away the emotion, the flattery, and the status of his accusers, and just leaves this gaping, embarrassing hole in the middle of their legal case. It's brilliant.
It really is.
But then, right when he has systematically dismantled the political and capital charges, he makes what the author calls the doctrinal pivot.
This is a huge moment.
And this is where the profound theological implications of this text really explode. Paul freely confesses to the court. He says, I confess this to you, that I worship the God of our ancestors according to the way which they call a sect, believing everything that is according to the law and that is written in the prophets.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is the absolute pivot point of the entire narrative. Paul is aggressively reframing the conflict here.
How so?
Remember, Tertullus tried to paint Christianity as a rogue, illegal, unsanctioned cult to strip it of legal protection under Rome.
Right.
Well, Paul counters by deeply and explicitly anchoring the way within the historical, legally protected tradition of mainstream Judaism.
He's saying, I'm not rejecting our heritage, I'm the fulfillment of it.
Exactly. He says, I worship the God of our ancestors. I believe everything in the law and the prophets. He is demonstrating that he isn't a political rebel. He is a devout, observant Jew.
That completely flips the script.
It does. And by doing this, he executes a brilliant legal judo move. He takes what Tertullus framed as a Roman treason trial, and he turns it back into an internal Jewish religious dispute.
Oh, because if it's an internal Jewish religious dispute, Felix has no jurisdiction to execute him.
Bingo.
He's telling Felix, this isn't about Rome, this isn't about Caesar. This is a theological argument over the interpretation of Jewish texts.
Precisely. Paul argues that he came to Jerusalem not to incite a riot, but to bring charitable gifts for the poor of his nation and to present offerings. He was found ritually purified in the temple, not desecrating it.
So he's checking all the boxes of a devout follower.
Right. He is proving that he honors the holiness of God and the institutions of his people. But the absolute zenith of his defense, the moment that truly shakes the room, is when he identifies the true core of this theological conflict.
The resurrection.
Yes.
Paul states that there is really only one thing he is actually on trial for. He says, I'm on trial before you today concerning the resurrection of the dead. He tells Felix that he has a hope in God that there is going to be a resurrection of both the righteous and the unrighteous.
Such a bold statement.
Now, the author emphasizes that this is a highly strategic move, but I want to understand the mechanism of why it worked. Why did throwing the word resurrection into the room cause such absolute chaos for the prosecution?
Well, because Paul is taking a massive, well-known theological fault line and driving a wedge right into it.
A fault line among the Jews.
Exactly. The Jewish leadership sitting in that courtroom was not a monolith. They were deeply divided on this exact issue. You had the Pharisees, the group Paul himself was trained in, who believed ardently in the resurrection of the dead, angels and spirits.
And then you had the Sadducees.
Right. And the Sadducees, which included the high priest Annas, who was currently sitting there demanding Paul's death, they vehemently denied the resurrection.
Really? They didn't believe in an afterlife at all.
No. They only accepted the first 5 books of Moses and rejected the idea of an afterlife or bodily resurrection. They were the theological and political aristocrats who wanted to maintain the earthly status quo.
So Paul essentially lobs a theological grenade right onto the prosecution's table.
He absolutely does. He is forcing Felix, a pagan Roman governor who probably cares nothing about Jewish theology, to judge an issue that the highest Jewish leaders themselves violently disagree on.
That is wild.
Paul's implicit point is, what crime have I committed? Holding a religious belief that half of the men accusing me also hold.
Oh man, it completely defangs the prosecution.
It does. How can Ananias demand Paul's death for believing in the resurrection when half of Ananias' own council believes the exact same thing?
It's strategic genius. I mean,
Right.
it really is. But the source material also points out a profound takeaway for the believer here. It isn't just about winning a legal argument.
No, there's a much deeper layer.
Paul reveals the underlying philosophy of his entire life, right in the middle of this defense. The concept of the clear conscience. Paul says, this is the reason I do my best to always have a clear conscience toward God and toward people. And he connects that directly to his belief in the resurrection.
This is a crucial point the author emphasizes.
Mhm.
Why does Paul strive for a clear conscience? Because he believes there will be a resurrection for the purpose of judgment.
Right.
He knows, referencing Acts 10.42, that Jesus has been appointed by God as the ultimate judge of both the living and the dead.
Okay, let's map that to the listener's everyday reality. When you are facing a false trial, maybe not a literal Roman court, but, a situation where you are surrounded by people trying to destroy your reputation, your career, or your livelihood, what keeps you steady? What prevents you from resorting to their dirty tactics?
For Paul, it wasn't the hope of winning the argument. It was the absolute bedrock certainty that this Roman court is not the final court.
Wow.
Felix is not the ultimate judge. Ananias does not have the final say. There is a coming resurrection and a coming perfect judgment before God.
That puts everything in perspective.
It does. Because Paul knows he will eventually stand before the true judge, his primary goal in that Roman courtroom isn't self-preservation. It isn't saying whatever it takes to get out of chains. His primary goal is maintaining a clear conscience.
He refuses to play their game.
He refuses to lie, he refuses to manipulate, and he refuses to use Tertullus' tactics because he lives his life in the light of eternity, not just the immediate crisis.
That is an incredibly confronting paradigm. To be in a fight for your absolute survival, facing a demonstrably corrupt system, and your operating system defaults to, I need to make sure my conscience is clear before God, rather than I need to survive this at all costs.
It's a completely different way of operating.
It requires a level of faith that is, honestly, entirely alien to how our world operates today. And it brings us to a really fascinating juncture in the story. Paul has rested his case. He has logically destroyed the charges, highlighted the missing witnesses, and reframed the theology.
The ball is entirely in Felix's court.
Exactly. But Felix doesn't set him free.
No, he doesn't.
Mhm.
And this highlights the grim reality of the world Paul is operating in. Felix is in a very tight spot politically.
What do you mean?
Well, as a judge, he knows the defense has obliterated the prosecution. The lack of eyewitnesses makes a guilty verdict legally unjustifiable under Roman law.
So he should just let him go.
He should. But Felix is fundamentally a politician, not a jurist. He can't just release Paul, because doing that would infuriate Ananias and the powerful Jewish elders.
And his whole job is keeping them happy.
Right. His entire job, the reason Rome put him there, is to keep those exact men pacified so they don't instigate a rebellion.
So what does a corrupt politician do when the objective truth is politically inconvenient?
He stalls. He just kicks the can down the road.
The text says that Felix adjourned the hearing, saying, "When Lysias, the commanding officer, comes down, I will decide your case."
Yeah.
He makes up this excuse about needing more tactical information from the military tribune who originally arrested Paul in Jerusalem.
Right.
But the author of our source points out a massive, glaring flaw in this excuse.
Oh, it's a completely transparent lie. Lysias had already sent his testimony.
Wait, really?
Yes. If you look back at chapter 23, Lysias sent a formal letter to Felix along with Paul. In that letter, the commanding officer explicitly stated that he found Paul innocent of any charges deserving death or imprisonment.
Oh, wow.
He told Felix it was merely a dispute over Jewish law. Felix already has the commanding officer's official report. He doesn't need to wait for him at all.
He is absolutely stalling. He knows the truth, but he just refuses to act on it. Instead, he orders Paul to be kept under guard, though he does give him some freedom and allows his friends to care for him.
He's trying to play both sides.
Yeah, he's threading an impossible political needle. Keep the Jewish authorities happy by keeping Paul locked up, but pacify his own lingering conscience by not executing a Roman citizen he knows is innocent.
And the source adds a really illuminating detail about Felix here. It says Felix adjourned the trial because he actually understood the facts concerning the way more accurately than the accusers might have anticipated.
Hold on, I need to push back on that. Where does a ruthless pagan Roman governor get accurate, nuanced information about a fledgling Jewish sect called the Way? I mean, why would he even care?
The author suggests several avenues for his knowledge. First, we know from the text his current wife, Drusilla, was Jewish.
Right.
We'll get into her incredibly dramatic background in a moment, but she would have been highly aware of the messianic movements in Judea. But beyond that, Caesarea was a major metropolitan hub.
It was like the Roman capital of the area, right?
Exactly. The Roman administrative center was there. Cornelius, the Roman centurion who converted to Christianity under Peter, was stationed in Caesarea. Philip the Evangelist lived there.
So it was everywhere.
Right. Christianity wasn't a secret underground society. It was a loud public movement. Felix had undoubtedly heard the reports. He knew Christians weren't violent revolutionaries. He knew the Way wasn't a military threat to the Roman Empire.
So his delay has absolutely nothing to do with a lack of information. It is entirely a lack of integrity.
Yep.
He has the truth. He just lacks the courage to execute justice.
Mm.
And this brings us to a very strong piece of commentary from the author of our source material regarding the theological implications of systemic injustice.
This is a really profound section.
And I want to be very clear for you listening right now. Our goal today is to impartially report on the content provided in our source material. We're conveying the author's arguments exactly as they present them, without endorsing or taking any political sides ourselves.
Yes, and the author's argument here is deeply rooted in biblical theology. They use this ancient historical moment with Felix to make a direct comparison to the inconsistent decisions of modern governments.
How so?
The author asks why governments and institutions so often operate with such blatant double standards, and the author's answer is that they operate using a bag of stones with different weights.
A bag of stones with different weights. That's a very specific, evocative phrase. Let's really linger on that. Where does that come from, and what is the underlying mechanism of that metaphor?
It's a direct reference to the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. The author cites Proverbs 16.1 and Leviticus 19.36. Let's look at the ancient marketplace to understand the mechanism.
Okay, picture the marketplace.
Right. Merchants used physical stone weights on balance scales to measure out goods like grain or spices and to weigh out silver for payment.
So before standardized currency, everything was determined by weight.
Exactly. Now, a dishonest merchant would carry a bag with two different sets of stone weights. He'd have a lighter set of stones for selling.
Ah, I see where this is going.
So when he weighed out the grain he was selling to you, the scale balanced early and he gave you less product than you paid for.
And the heavier set.
He used the heavier set for buying. When it was time for you to weigh out your silver to pay him, he'd swap the stones. It took more of your silver to balance his heavier scale.
Wow. It was the ancient literal equivalent of putting your thumb on the scale.
Precisely. You had one standard for yourself and a different punishing standard for everyone else. God explicitly and repeatedly condemned this practice in the law and the prophets. He demanded just balances, just weights. He demanded objective, unflinching truth.
So how does the author apply this marketplace deception to Felix, and by extension, to human institutions today?
The author argues that human systems naturally default to using different stones to tip the scales in the direction that favors their own agendas. They don't weigh every case, or every individual, with the same objective standard of truth.
So it's situational ethics.
Yes. They use a light weight for their political allies and a heavy, crushing weight for their enemies. The author states, there's nothing progressive about it. It's as old as the Exodus.
Man.
Felix is the perfect ancient embodiment of this psychological and systemic corruption. The scale of justice clearly shows Paul is innocent. The evidence is overwhelming. But Felix swaps out the weights. He uses a different standard because the political cost of applying the truth is too high for his own career.
That is a staggering way to look at how humans justify corruption. We tell ourselves we are being pragmatic, but really we are just swapping out the weights in our bag based on who is standing in front of us.
Exactly. We sacrifice objective truth on the altar of personal convenience.
And that choice leaves an innocent man rotting in a cell. But the story doesn't end in that courtroom. While Felix stalled the public trial, human curiosity and perhaps, a sense of spiritual unease gets the better of him.
It does.
Some days later, Felix and his wife Drusilla send for Paul for a private audience.
And this is where the narrative shifts from a legal thriller to something resembling like a premium cable psychological drama.
Totally.
If you thought the courtroom dynamics were intense, the historical background of the people in this private room is staggering. The source provides the context for Felix and Drusilla, and it is vital for understanding what Paul is about to do.
Let's break down these psychological profiles. Start with Drusilla. Who is she?
Drusilla is only 19 years old at this time, around 57, but her lineage is incredibly dark, especially for a Christian prisoner to be facing. She is Jewish, the youngest daughter of Herod Agrippa I.
Wait, Herod Agrippa VII?
Yeah.
I need to get my Herodian dynasty straight. That's the king who violently persecuted the early church in Jerusalem, right?
Exactly. He was king over Palestine from AD 37 to 44. He's the man who had the Apostle James, the brother of John, executed with a sword.
Yeah.
He was the one who threw the Apostle Peter into prison, intending to execute him too. That is the family Drusilla comes from. She grew up in a household with a literal history of slaughtering the founding leaders of the movement Paul is now representing.
So Paul is sitting across from the daughter of the man who murdered his colleagues. That is wild. And what about her personal life? I'm guessing it wasn't quiet.
It was just as chaotic and defined by power politics. The historical context notes that she had previously been married to Azizus, the king of Emesa, a state within Syria.
Okay.
But Felix saw her, desired her, and used his power to break up that marriage. He stole another king's wife. She was reportedly only 16 years old when Felix convinced her to leave her husband and marry him.
Felix wasn't exactly a model of marital stability either, was he?
Not at all. The source notes he had been married twice before, both times to princesses. His first wife was actually the granddaughter of Mark Antony and Cleopatra.
You're kidding.
No. Felix was a man who used marriage entirely as a mechanism to advance his political career and climb the social ladder of the Roman Empire.
Okay, so let's synthesize this. You have Felix, a ruthless, ambitious former slave who climbed to power over the bodies of crucified rebels and used royal marriages to secure his status.
Right.
And you have Drusilla, a 19-year-old runaway princess from a dynasty that murders apostles living in an adulterous marriage. These are the people who hold the literal keys to Paul's cell.
It's quite a room.
And they call this prisoner into a private, comfortable room and say, "Tell us about your faith in Christ Jesus."
You have to try and put yourself in Paul's mindset in that exact moment. The temptation must have been astronomical.
I can't even imagine.
You are speaking to the man who can sign your release papers today. They want to hear about your religion. The human instinct is to soften the message, make it palatable. Give them a comforting philosophical chat about love, peace, and universal brotherhood in the hopes of winning their favor and getting released.
Just tell them what they want to hear.
Exactly.
But the author highlights that Paul does the exact opposite. He doesn't deliver a TED Talk on finding your inner peace. He delivers a sermon that literally terrifies a tyrant. The text says Paul discussed three very specific things with them: righteousness, self-control, and the coming judgment.
This raises a profoundly important question for you, the listener. Why did Paul choose this exact theological focus? He had the entire spectrum of Christian theology at his disposal.
He could have talked about anything.
Right. He could have talked about the parting of the Red Sea. He could have dazzled them with the miracles of Jesus. He could have focused entirely on the grace and forgiveness of God. But he chooses righteousness, self-control, and judgment.
The author argues it was a surgical strike.
It was. The author points out that Paul chose these topics because Felix and Drusilla were, to quote the source, notoriously deficient in all three of these areas. This wasn't abstract theology. It was a highly targeted, spirit-led conviction of their specific personal morality.
Let's map that out. First, righteousness.
Righteousness is the standard of God's perfect justice. Paul is looking at a man who bought his power through blood, who takes bribes, who perverts justice, and he talks to him about the unwavering standard of divine righteousness that exposes all human corruption.
Wow. Okay, what about self-control?
Well, Paul is looking at a couple whose marriage is based on stolen vows, unchecked lust, and political ambition. They have given themselves over entirely to their appetites. Paul talks to them about the necessity of mastering the flesh and submitting desires to the lordship of Christ.
He's not holding back. And finally, the coming judgment.
He is looking at an earthly judge who thinks he holds the ultimate power of life and death. And Paul calmly explains to him that there is an ultimate, inescapable coming judgment. And on that day, Felix will not be on the bench. He will be the one in chains, answering for the blood on his hands and the unequal weights in his bag.
That is so powerful.
Paul's emphasis perfectly aligns with what Jesus said the Holy Spirit would do in John 16, convict the world concerning sin, righteousness, and judgment.
And it hits the target with devastating effect. The text says that as Paul was discussing these things, Felix became frightened. And the source points out the specific Greek word used here, emphobos.
Yes, emphobos. It doesn't mean he was just mildly uncomfortable or intellectually challenged. Emphobos means terrified, stricken with fear, trembling.
Wow, he was trembling.
The word of God, wielded by a man with a clear conscience, had pierced right through layers of Roman authority, political cynicism, and personal arrogance, and had struck the core of his conscience. The Holy Spirit was actively convicting him in that room.
He is terrified. He's under the agonizing weight of conviction. But this is where the story turns into a profound human tragedy. What does he do with that terror? Does he fall to his knees and repent?
No, he absolutely does not. The text says Felix tells Paul, "Go away for now, and when I have an opportunity, I will send for you." He abruptly dismisses the messenger to escape the agonizing pressure of the message.
The tragedy of convenient timing.
Precisely. The author highlights this as an incredibly common and eternally tragic human decision. Felix was apparently perfectly willing to discuss theology as a hobby, to treat religion as an intellectual exercise to pass the time.
Sure, just shooting the breeze.
But the exact moment that theology demanded personal morality, the moment it required him to change his life and relinquish his sin, he shut the conversation down.
The author points out that Felix's decision to postpone his relationship with God is a psychological defense mechanism we see all the time today. People feel the conviction of truth. They know they need to change, but they put off the decision, telling themselves they're just waiting for a more convenient time.
Right, a time when it won't cost them so much.
But the severe warning the source derives from this is that the convenient time rarely, if ever, comes. Often people put it off until they are ultimately unable to repent. The conviction fades, the conscience becomes calloused, the heart hardens, and the opportunity is lost forever.
It's a terrifying thought.
Which perfectly and tragically transitions us into the final act of this story, the wrap-up of Acts 24. We get to see the exact long-term result of that hardened heart. Felix's moment of terror didn't lead to repentance. It led right back to his basest, most cynical instincts, greed.
Right.
We entered this bizarre 2-year limbo.
The text says that Felix kept calling for Paul over those 2 years, talking with him often. But it wasn't because he wanted to learn more about righteousness, self-control, or judgment.
Then why?
The text explicitly states he was hoping Paul would give him money. He was waiting for a bribe.
A slow-motion shakedown. But let's look at the mechanics of this. Why would a Roman governor think a traveling Jewish preacher had the kind of money to make a bribe worthwhile? And how do the economics of Roman prisons actually work?
It's a great question. First, remember Paul mentioned in his defense that he had come to Jerusalem bringing alms charitable gifts for the poor of his nation. Felix heard that.
He heard money.
He likely assumed that if Paul had access to funds to distribute to the poor, or if he was the leader of this new sect that had followers all over the empire, He must have access to significant capital.
That makes sense.
Secondly, the Roman prison system, particularly the custodia libera or open custody Paul was under, wasn't like modern prisons. The state didn't feed or clothe you. You were entirely reliant on your external network of friends and family to bring you supplies.
Wait, really? The state didn't feed the prisoners?
Nope. So the system itself was designed to expose a prisoner's financial backing. Felix lets Paul's friends visit him, watching to see how much support Paul really has.
He's testing the waters.
Exactly. The source notes that while provincial governors were strictly prohibited by Roman law, specifically the Lex Julia de Repetundus, from taking bribes from prisoners, the practice was rampant.
Everyone was doing it.
Right. It was entirely in character for a corrupt man like Felix to exploit his office. He was using his sovereign power over a man's life to try and extort a prisoner he already knew was completely innocent.
And this psychological torture goes on for 2 full years. 2 years of Paul's life. A man whose entire driving purpose is to travel and plant churches, left rotting in a Roman detention facility in Caesarea, waiting on a corrupt politician to either find his conscience or get his payoff.
That's brutal.
But eventually, the clock runs out on Felix. His reign of terror catches up with him.
It does. The historical background provided in the source tells us that Felix's superiors finally relieved him of his position. And the reason is telling.
What happened?
He mishandled a violent civic conflict in Caesarea between the Jewish and Gentile residents. He sent in his troops, and they slaughtered a massive number of Jewish citizens and plundered their homes.
Oh my goodness.
Even for Rome, his methods were deemed too brutal and destabilizing. The Jewish leadership filed formal complaints, and Emperor Nero recalled him to Rome in disgrace. Depending on the historical dating, this happens around 80, 57, 58, or 59.
And he is replaced by a new governor, a man named Porcius Festus. But what does Felix do on his way out the door? He knows he's going back to Rome to face an inquiry. Does he finally clear his conscience and release the innocent man he's been holding hostage for 2 years?
No, he doesn't.
He leaves him there.
To try and appease the Jewish leadership on his way out, desperately trying to soften the blow of the severe complaints they were filing against him in Rome, Felix leaves Paul in prison.
That is just... it's so cowardly.
He uses an innocent man as a parting gift, a political bargaining chip, to pacify his enemies. And the source notes that his successor, Festus, will prove to be just as cynical. He's willing to sacrifice Paul for the exact same political favors, regardless of his guilt or innocence.
Which brings us to the ultimate theological takeaway of this entire document. The author concludes the analysis with one incredibly powerful, summarizing sentence. The apostle had become a political pawn in the will of God.
That phrase is just so heavy.
Let's really unpack the weight of that. A political pawn in the will of God.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger panoramic picture of the book of Acts, this sentence resolves the unbearable tension of the entire chapter. Because if you look at this purely on a human, earthly level, Paul looks like a victim.
Totally.
He looks like a tragic casualty of a profoundly corrupt, deeply broken legal system. He has been smeared by a silver-tongued lawyer using a rigged narrative. He has been held hostage by a greedy, terrified tyrant who uses unequal weights. And he's been forgotten in a cell for 2 years just to appease a political mob. To the naked eye, Paul looks entirely powerless.
He's crushed in the gears of the empire. But theologically, through the lens of the author's analysis, something entirely different is happening.
Exactly. The source points back to the very first paragraph of their document, referencing Acts 9.15. Think back to when Jesus first called Paul on the road to Damascus. Jesus said of Paul, "He is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel." The author is arguing that this corrupt Roman justice system wasn't thwarting God's sovereign plan. It was the precise mechanism God was using to fulfill it.
That is mind-bending. God is literally using corrupt politicians. The hatred of Ananias, the cynical rhetoric of Tertullus, the greed of Felix, the political maneuvering of Festus as pawns on his own board.
Yes.
He is using their sin to ensure that Paul gets a heavily guarded, taxpayer-funded escort into the absolute highest levels of the Roman Empire, eventually to Caesar himself.
It's incredible. God's sovereignty is so absolute, so vast, that he can use the unjust actions of evil men to accomplish his perfect divine purposes without violating their free will or absolving their guilt.
That's a huge paradigm shift.
It is. Paul is a political pawn to Rome, yes, but he is a chosen instrument in the will of God. This completely reorients how you are meant to view suffering, delays, and systemic injustice.
Because it shows we don't have the whole picture.
Right. It demonstrates that God's timeline and God's methods rarely align with our own. We demand immediate release. We demand instant vindication. But God wanted a witness in the halls of power, and he used a 2-year stint in a Judean jail cell to forge that witness.
Wow. That is a heavy, beautiful, and deeply challenging way to look at things. And it brings us to the end of our deep dive today.
Oh,
For everyone listening out there seeking knowledge and perspective to navigate a complex world, let's just synthesize what we've walked through.
so much good stuff here.
We've seen a masterclass in how to dismantle deceptive, emotionally charged smear campaigns, not with louder emotions, but with verifiable facts and clear logic. We've explored the profound, terrifying challenge of maintaining a clear conscience under immense pressure, recognizing that human courts are temporary, but divine judgment is eternal.
Amen to that.
We've examined the psychology of unequal weights, the systemic corruption that plagues human institutions, and the tragic reality of those who put off dealing with the state of their own souls until it is forever too late. And perhaps most inspiring, we've seen what it actually looks like to boldly speak absolute truth, righteousness, self-control, and judgment to the very people who hold our earthly lives in their hands.
There is an immense amount to reflect on here. I think the challenge to examine our own lives for those moments of convenient delays, those times we push the convicting truth away because it demands too much of us, that is something every single one of us needs to sit with. And we have to ask ourselves, whose weights are we using to measure our lives?
I couldn't agree more. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over on your own. We started today by picturing a man in chains, seemingly powerless, yet putting his powerful captors on trial. Think about your own life in the modern world. If your life, your core beliefs, and your actions were suddenly put on trial today by a culture that fundamentally didn't understand you, a world armed with silver-tongued algorithms, coordinated outrage, and unequal weights, what would your defense be? Would you naturally pivot to the ultimate hope of the resurrection, maintaining a clear conscience before God? Or would you just default to whatever self-preservation tactics would get you out of trouble the fastest? That's a tough question. Paul chose the resurrection, he chose the clear conscience, and his defense eventually shook the Roman Empire to its absolute core. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. Keep asking the hard questions, keep seeking the truth, and we will catch you next time.